Heart-stopping moment. Canine German Shepherd leaps from a 55-foot waterfall. Then something shocking happens. The air was thick with tension as the roaring sound of the waterfall echoed through the cliffs. All eyes were locked on a brave canine German Shepherd named Shadow, standing at the very edge of a crumbling rock ledge, his muscles tense, eyes focused below where a terrified child clung helplessly to a slippery stone. In a split second, Shadow made an impossible decision. He leapt from the towering 55-foot waterfall without hesitation. But what happened next left everyone speechless. Get ready for a story that will redefine bravery, loyalty, and the unbreakable wall between a hero dog and the people he protects. Before we dive into this unbelievable rescue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss more heartwarming and inspiring stories just like this one. It was supposed to be a quiet summer afternoon at Whispering Falls State Park. Families gathered along the riverbanks, children laughed as they played near the shallow waters, and hikers roamed the winding trails above the cliffs. Sergeant Daniel Cross, a seasoned police officer, had brought his canine partner, Shadow, out for what he thought would be a routine patrol and a bit of fresh air. But fate had other plans. Shadow, a powerful black and tan German Shepherd canine, was known throughout the force not just for his exceptional tracking skills, but for his almost human intuition. He had saved lives before, but nothing could have prepared either of them for what was about to unfold. As they walked along the upper ridge overlooking the massive waterfall, Shadow's ears suddenly perked up. His body stiffened, and a low, urgent growl rumbled from his throat. Sergeant Cross knew that sound. Shadow had detected something serious. Before he could react, Shadow took off at full speed, his powerful legs propelling him through the thick underbrush toward the cliff's edge. "Shadow, stay!" Daniel shouted, sprinting after him, his heart pounding harder with every step. When Daniel broke through the trees, his stomach dropped. Just feet from the sheer drop, Shadow stood motionless, his eyes locked on a small figure, barely visible against the jagged rocks far below. It was a child, a boy no older than 6, trapped on a narrow ledge halfway down the cliff. The rushing waters of the falls roared beside him, drowning out the sound of his cries. His tiny hands gripped the wet stone desperately, his face pale with fear. Time seemed to freeze. Panic-stricken parents stood helplessly at the river's base, screaming for someone, anyone to help. But no human could reach the boy from below, and the cliffs were too steep for even the most experienced climbers to descend without equipment. Daniel turned to Shadow. The dog had already assessed the situation, his intelligent eyes flicking between the child and the drop below. Then, without hesitation, Shadow backed up, his paws digging into the soft earth. "Shadow, no!" Daniel shouted, realizing too late what his partner was about to do. With a mighty leap, Shadow launched himself off the edge of the cliff, his body arcing through the open air as if defying gravity itself. Gasps and screams echoed from those watching below. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Daniel rushed to the edge and looked down, terrified of what he might see. But against all odds, Shadow's powerful body collided with the ledge just inches from the boy. His claws scrambled against the wet rock, searching for a hold, and then, miraculously, he steadied himself. The boy cried out, his tiny frame shaking with terror, but Shadow was already in action. The dog pressed his body against the child to keep him from slipping, nudging him gently but firmly away from the edge. Daniel knew Shadow was trained for rescues, but this was something else entirely. Without ropes, without safety, the dog had put his own life on the line. Below, a rescue team was gathering, but they were minutes away from being able to do anything. Every second counted. Daniel's mind raced. He knew Shadow couldn't hold that position forever, and the boy was still at risk of falling. And then, something even more incredible happened. The boy, sensing the safety and calm radiating from the brave dog, slowly reached out and grabbed onto Shadow's harness. His tiny fingers locked onto the thick strap as if it were the only lifeline he had left. Shadow turned his head, nudging the boy's hands to grip tighter. Daniel leaned over the edge, his voice firm but calm. "Hold on, buddy. Help is almost there. Stay with Shadow. He's got you." At that moment, Shadow looked up toward Daniel. Their eyes met, and Daniel could swear the brave canine was telling him, "I've got this. Just bring them home safe." The river roared beneath them, and the ledge seemed to shrink with every passing second. Daniel knew it was only the beginning of a rescue that would test every ounce of courage in that loyal dog's heart. And as the crowd below fell silent, all eyes remained fixed on the impossible scene unfolding on the side of the cliff. Shadow wasn't just a police dog. He was a hero in every sense of the word. And this was only the beginning. The scene below had drawn an anxious crowd. Phones were out, cameras rolling, but no one dared to speak above the roar of the falls. It was as if every breath held back might somehow buy the child and Shadow just a few more precious seconds. Sergeant Daniel Cross stayed low near the cliff's edge, calculating every possible scenario. Rescue climbers were still several minutes out, assembling ropes and harnesses. But Daniel knew they didn't have minutes. That ledge was crumbling. The boy, his small body trembling against the slick rock face, kept his fingers locked around Shadow's harness. His knuckles were white, and his tiny shoes kept slipping against the wet stone. Shadow pressed his weight firmly against the child, positioning his body like a shield against the deadly drop just inches away. Every muscle in the dog's powerful frame trembled with tension, but his eyes remained focused and calm. Down below, the child's mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at the arms of park rangers who held her back from the water's edge. His father paced along the rocks helplessly, shouting his son's name over and over. "Shadow, just hold on, buddy. Hold on," Daniel muttered under his breath. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the gorge. Daniel's heart seized as a jagged piece of rock broke away from the ledge near Shadow's hind legs, tumbling down into the raging waters below. The ledge was falling apart right under them. "Shadow, hang in there!" Daniel called out, his voice breaking against the sound of the falls. And then, Daniel spotted it. A narrow crevice, about 6 feet to Shadow's left, carved deep into the rock face. If Shadow could just move the boy toward that crevice, there might be a chance to stabilize them both until help arrived. But it was a nearly impossible task. The ledge was slick and crumbling. One wrong move and they'd both fall. Daniel made a split-second decision. He pulled his radio to his mouth. "This is Sergeant Cross. I need immediate rope support at my position. I'm going down." "Negative, Sergeant," a voice crackled through the radio. "The area's too unstable. Stand by." "There's no time," Daniel snapped, tossing the radio aside. He reached for his rope gear, but knew it wouldn't matter. He didn't have enough line to make it all the way down, and by the time the backup team reached him, it would be too late. Daniel crouched down again, locking eyes with Shadow. "Come on, boy. Show me that miracle." Almost as if he'd heard and understood, Shadow shifted his position carefully, inching sideways along the narrow ledge. His paws slipped once, sending another cascade of pebbles and dirt into the abyss, but the brave canine held his ground. With every careful movement, he nudged the boy closer to the crevice. The child's terrified sobs echoed faintly against the rocks, but his grip on the harness remained unbroken. "Good boy, Shadow. Just a little more," Daniel whispered, his hands gripping the edge of the cliff so tightly his knuckles turned pale. At that moment, the boy's foot slipped completely off the ledge. A collective scream rose from the crowd below, as his body lurched forward. But Shadow moved like lightning. He lunged forward, grabbing the boy's jacket in his powerful jaws, his paws scrambling furiously for balance. The boy dangled for a second, one terrifying second, before Shadow used every ounce of his strength to pull him back against the rock. Finally, with one last desperate push, Shadow guided the boy into the safety of the crevice. The child pressed himself into the narrow space, sobbing uncontrollably but safe, his hands still buried in Shadow's thick fur. From above, Daniel felt the tears burning his eyes. Shadow had done the impossible, but now they were both stuck there, and the ledge wouldn't hold for long. "Shadow, stay with him!" Daniel shouted. "Help's coming!" Through the tension and the roar of the water, Daniel could almost feel the determination radiating from his partner. Shadow didn't look up this time. His only focus was the frightened boy beside him. And just as the first rescue climber finally appeared on the cliff above, preparing to rappel down, the ledge gave one final groan. A larger section of rock collapsed under Shadow's hind legs. Daniel's heart stopped. The sound of the collapsing stone echoed through the gorge like a final warning. Shadow's hind legs scrambled for traction as the ledge crumbled beneath him, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling into the roaring waters below. "Shadow!" Daniel cried out, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The German Shepherd's front paws clung desperately to the remaining strip of rock while his hindquarters hung over the abyss. The boy Mustafa screamed in terror, his tiny hands still clutching the harness, as if his life depended on it, which, in truth, it did. For a terrifying moment, it looked like both of them would fall. But then, through sheer strength and unshakable will, Shadow found a foothold. His powerful claws dug into a crack in the rock, and with a low, determined growl, he pulled himself back onto the ledge. "Good boy! That's it, Shadow! Just hold on!" Daniel shouted from above, his voice cracking with emotion. By now, the first rescue climber was descending, but the process felt agonizingly slow. Every second stretched endlessly as the man worked his way down the jagged face of the cliff, careful not to dislodge more debris. The child's sobs quieted just slightly, his tiny body pressed against Shadow's thick fur. Somehow, the presence of the brave canine gave him a sliver of comfort amidst the chaos. Down below, the crowd stood motionless, their phones lowered, their hands clasped over their mouths in silent prayer. The boy's mother had fallen to her knees, tears streaming down her face, whispering pleas into the wind. Daniel never took his eyes off his partner. He had seen Shadow perform incredible feats during their years together, tracking missing persons, taking down dangerous criminals, even detecting hidden explosives, but nothing like this. Shadow wasn't just working on instinct. He was choosing to stay with that boy, risking his life to protect him. Minutes felt like hours as the rescue climber finally neared the crevice. He carefully swung himself closer, his boots scraping against the rock face. "You're doing great, kid. You're almost safe," the rescuer called gently to the boy, his voice calm despite the dangerous situation. Shadow turned his head, his deep brown eyes locking onto the rescuer. It was as if the dog understood that help had arrived and his mission was almost over. But even then, he didn't relax. His body remained tense, ready to react at any moment if the ledge gave way again. The climber reached into his harness and pulled out a small safety line. He slowly edged toward the boy and Shadow, speaking softly the whole time. "Buddy, I need you to let go of the harness and take my hand," he said, extending his gloved fingers toward the child. The boy looked at him through tear-filled eyes, and then at Shadow. The dog gave a low, reassuring whine and gently nudged the boy's shoulder with his snout, encouraging him to move. Slowly, so painfully slowly, the boy released his grip on the harness and reached out for the rescuer's hand. Their fingers met, and within moments, the rescuer had the boy secured in a harness of his own. A wave of relief washed over the crowd as the boy was carefully lifted from the crevice. His mother collapsed completely, sobbing with relief as she watched her son being brought to safety. But Shadow remained behind. Daniel leaned dangerously over the cliff's edge, shouting down, "Hold on, Shadow. I'm coming for you." The climber above began preparing a second line to retrieve the heroic dog, but time was running out. The rock under Shadow's paws groaned again, and this time, the crack spread visibly along the ledge. Shadow's eyes flicked upward. He knew. And just as the ledge crumbled entirely beneath him, Shadow made his final move. With a burst of raw strength and incredible precision, he leapt toward the remaining section of the cliff, his claws barely catching the edge. Daniel lunged forward, reaching out his hand. "I've got you, Shadow. Just hold on." Shadow's powerful paws clawed at the rock as his body dangled over the deadly drop. Daniel strained with everything he had, his fingers brushing against Shadow's harness. And then, he caught it. Daniel's fist clenched around the thick strap, his muscles screaming as he held the full weight of the 85-pound German Shepherd. "Don't you let go, Shadow! I've got you!" Daniel growled through gritted teeth. The climbers scrambled to secure a line around the dog, and within seconds, they pulled Shadow up to safety. As soon as his paws hit solid ground, Shadow turned and pressed his head against Daniel's chest, letting out a low, exhausted whine. "You did it, buddy. You saved that boy. You're a hero," Daniel whispered, his own tears falling freely now as he hugged his loyal partner. The entire gorge erupted in applause and cheers, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a triumph of life over death. But for Daniel and Shadow, this moment wasn't about applause or heroism. It was about trust, courage, and a bond forged stronger than steel. And neither of them would ever be the same again. The hours after the rescue unfolded in a strange blur. Reporters gathered at the base of Whispering Falls, their cameras aimed at the cliffs, desperate to capture every heroic angle of the day's events. Rescue teams worked tirelessly to secure the area, their faces still pale with the weight of what could have been a tragedy. But Sergeant Daniel Cross wasn't interested in the cameras or the questions. His entire focus was on Shadow. The brave German Shepherd had held his head high when the rescue team secured him on solid ground. But the moment they reached the safety pay of the park's ranger station, his strength seemed to drain away. Shadow collapsed onto the cool tile floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, his body trembling from exhaustion. "Shadow, stay with me, buddy. Stay with me," Daniel murmured, kneeling by his sin. He ran a hand gently over Shadow's damp fur, feeling the heat radiating off his overworked muscles. A nearby veterinarian rushed over, a young woman named Dr. Emily Carter, who had volunteered at the park for years. Her expression was tight with concern as she knelt beside them. "Let me take a look," she said, her hands moving expertly over Shadow's body. She checked his pulse, his breathing, examined his bones, worn raw from the sharp rocks, and gently pressed against his ribcage. "Is he going to be okay?" Daniel asked, his throat thick with emotion. Dr. Carter met his eyes. "He's exhausted and dehydrated, and his paws are pretty torn up, but the biggest risk is shock. He's been through something no dog should ever have to endure. We need to calm him down and get fluids into him immediately." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "Do whatever it takes. He's more than a partner. He's my family." As Dr. Carter prepared an IV and began treating Shadow's wounds, Daniel sat close, his hand never leaving his partner's side. Shadow's breathing was labored, but his eyes stayed open, following Daniel's every move as if to reassure him, "I'm still here." Meanwhile, the rescued boy, Lucas, as they'd learned his name, was reunited with his parents. Despite his ordeal, he seemed remarkably unharmed, save for a few scrapes and bruises. His mother couldn't stop crying as she held him close, whispering words of gratitude toward anyone who would listen. But when she spotted Daniel sitting with Shadow, she approached, her eyes red and swollen. "Sergeant Cross?" she began, her voice trembling. Daniel stood up slowly, glancing back at Shadow before meeting her gaze. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "If it weren't for your dog." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand over her mouth to hold back a sob. Daniel shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. You thank him." He turned toward Shadow, who lifted his head just slightly at the sound of his name. The woman knelt down beside the brave German Shepherd, her hand trembling as she reached out and gently stroked his ear. "Thank you," she whispered, tears falling freely. "You saved my son. You're an angel." Shadow's tail gave a weak, slow wag. Even in his exhaustion, he understood. By nightfall, the park had emptied, the media vans had moved on, and quiet finally returned to the ranger station. Shadow slept soundly now, his body recovering, a blanket draped gently over him. Daniel sat by his side, refusing to leave. His mind played the day's events over and over again, each moment more unbelievable than the last. "Rest easy, Shadow," he whispered softly. "You don't have to be the hero tonight. You've already done more than anyone could have asked for." As the night deepened, a soft knock came at the door. Dr. Carter stepped inside, a small, hopeful smile on her tired face. "He's stable now. Strong heart, no internal injuries. You've got one tough soldier there, Sergeant." Daniel let out a long breath he didn't even realize he'd been holding. "Thank you, Doc, for everything." She smiled and nodded toward the sleeping dog. "Take him home in the morning. He's earned a soft bed and a few weeks off duty." Daniel reached down and brushed his hand over Shadow's head again. "You hear that, boy? Vacation time." And for the first time since the rescue, Daniel saw it. A small, contented sigh from Shadow, his tail thumping faintly against the floor before he drifted back into a deep, peaceful sleep. But deep down, Daniel knew this wasn't the end of their journey. Shadow's heroism had changed more than just the lives of a scared little boy and his family. It had changed something in Daniel too. Because sometimes it takes looking over the edge of a cliff to realize what really matters and who you're willing to fight for. The next morning dawned with a quiet serenity that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the day before. A soft mist hung over Whispering Falls, and the air was cool, the kind that whispered promises of healing and second chances. Sergeant Daniel Cross woke in the chair where he had spent the night, his back stiff and his uniform wrinkled. But none of that mattered. His eyes went immediately to Shadow, still curled up on the blanket, his breathing slow but steady. "Morning, hero," Daniel whispered as he crouched down, gently stroking the dog's ear. Shadow stirred, his deep brown eyes fluttering open. For a moment, Daniel worried the spark might be gone, that the trauma had done something to his partner's indomitable spirit. But then, slowly, that familiar tail gave a soft wag against the floor. "There you are," Daniel murmured, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Toughest dog I've ever known." Before Daniel could stand, there was a light knock at the door. Dr. Emily Carter stepped in with a clipboard in hand, a warm but cautious smile on her face. "How's our brave boy this morning?" she asked softly. Daniel stood and stretched, then glanced back at Shadow. "Still here, still fighting." Dr. Carter crossed the room and knelt by Shadow's side, her hands gently checking his bandaged paws and monitoring his pulse. Shadow licked her hand once, a grateful gesture that made her eyes glisten. "He's a fighter, all right," she said, standing and flipping through the notes on her clipboard. "But, Sergeant, I need to be honest. Physically, he'll heal, but psychologically, what he went through wasn't just dangerous, it was traumatic. You'll need to watch him closely in the coming weeks. Sometimes dogs like him carry that burden silently." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll stay on top of it. He's never alone. not for a second. Before she left, Dr. Carter handed Daniel a small envelope. "From the boy's family. They asked me to give this to you personally." Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands, the handwriting shaky but heartfelt. He opened it slowly. Inside was a simple thank you card, but it wasn't the card that stopped Daniel cold. It was the drawing tucked inside. A crayon sketch, childlike and raw, but powerful in its simplicity. A boy standing on a cliff, his tiny hand gripping the harness of a large German shepherd who stood bravely by his side. Above them, a smiling sun and the words written in uneven letters. "My hero, Shadow." Daniel swallowed hard, his vision blurring as he carefully folded the drawing back into the envelope. Outside, the day moved on, but something deep inside Daniel had shifted. Later that afternoon, against Dr. Carter's cautious advice, Daniel decided to take Shadow home. The ranger station felt too clinical, too full of reminders of what had nearly been lost. Shadow needed comfort, familiar sights and smells, the feel of home under his weary paws. The ride back to their small house, outside of town, was silent. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the console, his eyes half closed but always flicking toward Daniel as if to say, "I'm still right here." When they pulled into the driveway, something strange happened. Shadow, despite his injuries, perked up. His ears stood tall, and his eyes grew sharp with focus. Before Daniel could even open the door, Shadow was out of the vehicle, limping but determined, his nose working furiously at the air. "Shadow?" "Easy, boy, what is it?" Shadow moved toward the backyard, his body low and tense, despite his bandaged paws. Daniel followed close behind, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his side. And then they saw it. Near the edge of the property, by the old tool shed, a young man crouched low, clearly trying to stay hidden. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he tried to pick the lock on the shed's door. Daniel's instincts kicked in. "Police, don't move!" The man froze, then bolted. But he hadn't accounted for the dog who had just survived the impossible. Despite his injuries, Shadow took off like a missile, cutting off the man's escape route. He stood his ground, barking sharply, forcing the intruder to cower against the fence until Daniel reached them. With swift, practiced movements, Daniel cuffed the man and called in backup. As officers arrived and took the would-be thief into custody, Daniel looked down at Shadow, who stood tall despite his exhaustion. His tail wagged once, slow and steady. Daniel knelt and pulled him close. "Even after everything, you're still protecting me, still protecting this family," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're more than a hero, Shadow. You're a legend." And as the sun began to set over the horizon, bathing the yard in golden light, Daniel realized something powerful. Shadow didn't just survive the fall. He conquered it. The days that followed were quiet, but filled with a different kind of tension. Shadow's body was healing. Dr. Carter visited regularly to monitor his progress, changing the bandages on his torn paws and ensuring his hydration stayed up. But Daniel knew that some wounds weren't visible, and those were the hardest to heal. At night, Shadow would sleep soundly for hours, but then, without warning, he'd jolt awake, panting heavily, his eyes wide as if reliving that terrifying moment on the cliff's edge. Daniel was always there, his hand gently resting on Shadow's side until his breathing calmed and his eyes softened with recognition. "It's over, boy," Daniel would whisper into the quiet darkness. "You're safe now." But deep down, he understood. Some memories don't fade just because we tell them to. They have to be lived through, felt, and finally accepted. And just like any soldier returning from battle, Shadow was learning how to carry his invisible scars. One particular morning, a soft knock came at the door. Daniel wasn't expecting anyone, but when he opened it, standing there was Lucas, the little boy from the cliffs, clutching a small, stuffed German Shepherd toy in his arms. His mother stood a few paces behind him, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Lucas looked up at Daniel, his small voice barely above a whisper. "Is Shadow here?" Daniel swallowed hard, stepping aside and motioning them in. "He's right here, buddy." Shadow was lying on his favorite spot near the back window, the sunlight streaming in, casting a warm glow across his fur. When he saw Lucas, his tail lifted slightly and wagged, slow but steady. Lucas walked over cautiously, kneeling down beside him. For a moment, he just sat there, the stuffed dog pressed tightly to his chest. Then, he reached out and placed a small, shaky hand on Shadow's head. "Hi, Shadow. I drew you something," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He gently placed it next to the dog's paw before leaning down to rest his head against Shadow's side. Shadow let out a long, peaceful sigh and closed his eyes. For the first time in days, his body relaxed completely. Daniel felt the lump in his throat grow, unable to speak as he watched the quiet moment of healing take place before his eyes. Lucas's mother stepped beside Daniel. "He's been asking every day to see him," she whispered. "He wouldn't sleep until I promised to bring him." Daniel nodded, his voice low. "It's good for both of them, I think." The visit stretched on for hours, and for the first time since that terrifying day, Shadow seemed to find real rest. He lay beside Lucas, their breathing falling into the same gentle rhythm, as if in some unspoken way they were helping each other heal. When it was time to leave, Lucas stood up and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of Shadow's head. "You're my hero forever," he whispered. Shadow opened his eyes, lifted his head, and pressed his snout gently into the boy's chest. That small gesture held more power than any medal or ceremony ever could. As they left, Daniel sat down beside Shadow and opened the folded paper Lucas had left. It was another drawing, this time of Shadow standing tall on a hill, a shining medal drawn around his neck. Above him, in bold, bright letters, Lucas had written, "Shadow the Brave." Daniel stared at it for a long moment before tucking it carefully into his wallet. Some things were too precious to be left behind. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. Shadow had spent years on duty, saving lives, chasing down criminals, and putting himself in harm's way without hesitation. He had more than earned his rest. With a heavy but proud heart, Daniel called the precinct and submitted Shadow's official retirement paperwork. No more dangerous missions. No more long nights on patrol. From now on, Shadow would live his days in peace, surrounded by the people who loved him most. That afternoon, Daniel took him to the park, the one with the wide, open fields and tall trees. Even with his healing paws, Shadow trotted alongside Daniel with that familiar glimmer in his eyes, his ears perked, his nose taking in the fresh breeze. They sat by the lake as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Shadow rested his head on Daniel's lap, his eyes half closed but filled with contentment. "You did more than enough, my friend," Daniel whispered, running his fingers through Shadow's thick fur. "You saved a life, and in doing that, you saved mine too." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing them both in the soft glow of twilight, it was clear that Shadow's story had become something bigger than a heroic rescue. It was a story of sacrifice, loyalty, and a bond so unbreakable that even the edge of death couldn't sever it. Shadow had found his peace. And now, finally, so had Daniel.